You know, when I first realized the Flat Earth Society was a thing, it was when watching Vsauce's video on it. And one thing he explained that some flat earthers believe is that the flat earth is accelerating upwards at 9.8 meters per second. So that's what I thought flat earthers believed at the moment, and while some do, I don't think most do. So we're going to look at this a little bit, and we're going to be responding to Eric Dubay once again. Why another video on Eric Dubay? Because when I feel like responding to flat earthers, he's an easy pick because his videos are around 5 minutes. Yeah.
Recently, however, a few flat earthers have revived Leo Ferrari's old Flat Earth Society claim that the world is not, in fact, a level motionless plane, but rather a constantly upwards rising plane.
Indeed. This came about through trying to explain gravity on a flat Earth. But who is correct? Ooh, spooky. Flat Earthers fighting amongst themselves is such entertainment. For once, they can destroy each other instead of getting destroyed by non-flat Earthers. That being said, it's obvious that neither idea works on a flat Earth. Gravity simply just cannot be explained no matter how you slice the cake. I've made many videos on non-accelerating flat Earth gravity before. In fact, my last one was exactly on that. But regarding a flat Earth that's moving upwards, that would explain things a lot better actually, but still fails in many aspects.
These people cite experiments such as a helium balloon moving forward in an accelerating car.
Indeed, important because balloons don't act like that on Earth, where instead of going down, it goes up. But this would actually be true for other objects on Earth. You can feel yourself being thrown forwards or backwards during the acceleration of a car. So if we took that concept and applied it to explain gravity, as long as Earth is accelerating upwards, it would explain why things in general are being pulled down.
They claim the only possible way to explain these results is to assume Earth to be constantly rising at 9.8 meters per second, or approximately 22 miles per hour, straight upwards.
Why, thank you for enlightening us on what that would be if converted to miles per hour, because I was just dying to know what 9.8 meters per second converted to miles per hour was. That being said, it seems you completely misunderstood what the constant of gravity is. It's not 9.8 meters per second, it's 9.8 meters per second, which means it's a constant of acceleration, not velocity. But you know, you being the smartest person alive, I'm sure you made a small mistake in your script, so we'll ignore that for now.
There is some debate amongst them regarding whether this upward motion is a constant velocity or an acceleration.
It has to be an acceleration. First of all, you're trying to explain the 9.8 meters per second squared, which is an acceleration, not a velocity. Second of all, logically speaking, it would have to be an acceleration anyway. If you're in an airplane, for example, the airplane moves at a pretty constant speed, and when that happens, you don't feel anything. But if the plane accelerates, like when it's taking off, then you feel yourself being pulled backwards. Because we can only feel acceleration, not speed. If you just thought about it for 1 second, you would have known, right? Because you're the smartest person alive, of course.
But these new upward rising earthers have all recently come into agreement that our flat Earth can no longer be stationary. These upward rising earthers begin their inquiry innocently enough by asking questions about the directional vector of dropped objects, and why dense objects fall downwards rather than upwards or sideways, for example.
Yep, that's one of the advantages they have that you don't. They at least are able to explain direction with that idea, while you can't. But then, of course, that raises some other questions, such as why the Earth is accelerating upwards and not sideways, but that'd be a story for another day.
To this question, I would give the answer that there is a pressure gradient formed by the amount of stacked air, water, or land over you in a column, which increases the pressure, weight, and density the farther down you go, and that defines direction.
So I addressed this exact argument in my previous Flat Earth video, go check it out if you haven't. But TLDR, not only does a pressure gradient not explain why things are pulled in a certain direction, but also doesn't explain where this imaginary pressure gradient came from.
Unsatisfied with this answer, upward rising earthers,
upward rising flat earthers, haha, they're getting real creative now, aren't they?
Continue their inquiry by asking why then does Earth have a pressure gradient stacked in this particular fashion, with the densest layer at the bottom rather than the top or sides. Now, at this point, I would say such a line of questioning is tantamount to asking why is water wet or why is fire hot.
Huh? Absolutely not. When obtaining truth, there is always a why that follows up the main question, or how, or whatever. You shouldn't just be satisfied. Plus, the analogies you gave, we have proper answers for. Water is wet because wetness is defined as a property of water by our language system that defines what wet is. Fire is hot because it combusts fuel and releases energy, which is in the form of heat and light. You literally just gave two analogous questions that are easily answerable, trying to prove a point that doesn't exist. Bravo.
It's like asking, why don't we walk upside down on the sky and look up to the ground?
That's because there's gravity that pulls us downwards, which is why we're talking about this in the first place, because you're trying to explain gravity on the flat Earth.
It's similar to asking, why don't our arms grow out of our pelvis and legs grow out of our torso?
That one is because it was just how evolution determined it to be. Of course, we didn't have to turn out this way, but evolution takes whatever mutations we acquire by chance and selects them. If we had a mutation or a huge genomic shift that happened to grow our arms out of our pelvises, and that worked in terms of providing a survival advantage, then natural selection would have selected it and we would look exactly like that today. But that being said, again, these are worthwhile questions to ask. If you're religious and you believe in God, then that's also a valid question to ask on why God made us this particular shape. Is it because we're supposed to be an image of himself?
As anyone who has spent significant time with a 4-year-old knows, the question of, but why, if asked long enough, eventually leads to an infinite regress of explanations that can only be ended with the true, but potentially unsatisfying metaphysical answer of, it is that way, because that's how it was created to be.
Not only are you insulting whoever is asking that question by comparing them to a 4-year-old, you're also just dodging the question entirely. If your answer is, that's just how it's created to be, then say so. Don't give me a monologue about questions, no one asked for that. Anyway, that being said, you literally just don't have an answer, which is why you kept dodging the question, but it still stands. Why is the gradient made out to be this way? Why does it have a directional bias? And why does it even exist? Look, I agree to some extent that if you keep asking questions down a chain of questions, it eventually goes into unknown territory, but that doesn't mean we don't try to look for further answers. And this, of course, asking about the gradient is certainly not far enough to be considered worth stopping. Remember, you're the one proposing the idea to explain gravity, so it's up to you to give a sounding explanation with evidence to back up your point.
Rather than accept that Earth was simply created to have the particular arrangement of density layering that it does, upward rising Earthers instead claim that Earth must be a constantly upwards rising plane, and that this constant vertical motion is the only thing that can explain the directional vector.
Well, actually, once again, it has to be an acceleration, not a constant vertical velocity, as I've pointed out previously. But honestly, not being able to understand that is something I very much expect from you.
Now, while this could make for an interesting speculation, the fact of the matter is that dropping a water bottle with a cork in it, or watching a helium balloon go forward in a moving car, are not demonstrations of the Earth constantly rising upwards.
It's a demonstration of g-forces at work, and it's a demonstration of how objects are affected by things in speed. Of course, that doesn't mean the Earth is flying up at 9.8 meters per second, but honestly, it's better than anything you've provided so far. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, both ideas are straight up false, but it's fun watching the quarrel.
At best, these demonstrations provide tangential evidence for their line of questioning, but in no way prove their assumption that Earth is a constantly rising plane. In fact, upward rising Earthers are forced to pile assumption upon assumption in order to defend their new dogma. Assumption number 1. Their first assumption, in order to answer the question of directional vector, going against all common sense, our everyday experience, and countless scientific experiments proving Earth to be completely motionless, they make the grand assumption that Earth is constantly rising upwards 9.8 meters per second.
I don't understand. This is exactly the same thing you, in general, and Flat Earth in general, is being criticized for. You make a ton of assumptions, such as the very first assumption that the Earth is flat to begin with, without any evidence, and the only thing you can think about is how certain phenomenon on Earth is experienced on the flat Earth rather than the very first basic evidence on the Earth being flat in the first place. You are literally full of assumptions yourself. Plus, the rising flat Earth is more of a potential explanation on why we feel a force pulling us downwards rather than an assumption. The assumption in this, in all of this actually, is that the Earth is flat to begin with.
Assumption number 2. In order to have a world that constantly rises upwards forever, they are now forced to make a second assumption, which is that there exists an infinite expanse of empty space above our flat Earth, for the constantly rising world to rise into.
True, that is indeed an assumption. And also the idea that you'll eventually hit a speed so ridiculous that it wouldn't even make sense. Fair.
Assumption number 3. Next, they are forced to assume that the entire atmosphere is somehow fixed like glue to rise perfectly along with the upward rising Earth, because otherwise, the upward rising Earth would constantly be crashing up into the bottoms of birds, planes, helicopters, and everything else in flight above the forever upwards rising Earth.
Okay, but the point is, birds and planes fight against gravity, so the physical mechanisms that allow them to fly is the very mechanism that would keep them afloat at the earthward rising. So your third counter argument here doesn't actually make sense.
Assumption number 4. Finally, they are forced to assume that the sun, moon, and stars are also all constantly rising 9.8 meters per second, somehow fixed along with the rising atmosphere. Otherwise, of course, the upward rising Earth would crash into them as well.
Okay, but the same goes for you. You think the sun and moon are just simply floating in midair. So whatever mechanism you believe is holding the sun and moon up, that would be the same mechanism for the rising flat earthers, no? So before criticizing them, whom I believe deserves criticism, you have to give better explanations for your own model first. Anyway, at the end of the day, both ideas are completely ridiculous, and I don't even know why I'm wasting time responding to an internal quarrel between flat earthers, but nonetheless, it's somewhat fun to watch. Massive shout out to Fireshard, Alan Morton, Miss Fixit, and Rick Klen for their support on Patreon. I wouldn't be anywhere without you guys.